The gavel echoed through the mahogany-paneled courtroom like a death knell. She sat there in a faded navy blazer, staring at the scuffed floorboards, while the judge peered over his silver reading glasses with poorly concealed disdain. Her ex-husband smirked from across the aisle, adjusting his custom silk tie, entirely confident he was about to take their daughter and leave her utterly destitute. To everyone in that room, she was just another struggling nobody, a penniless gig worker begging for crumbs. They were seconds away from finalizing her absolute ruin. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The air conditioning in courtroom 302 of the Cook County Domestic Relations Division was broken, but the chill radiating from the bench was more than enough to freeze the blood in Pearl's veins. Pearl Woods sat perfectly still, her hands folded over a cheap, imitation leather portfolio. She wore a tailored but visibly worn grey suit she had bought off the clearance rack at Macy's 5 years ago. Opposite her sat Preston Sterling, a man who had recently sold his mid-tier logistics software startup for a cool $18 million. He looked every inch the self-made tech prodigy, sharp Brioni suit, a vintage Rolex Daytona gleaming on his wrist, and a posture that screamed invincibility. Next to Preston sat his legal attack dog, Beatrice Montgomery, a senior partner at the ruthless family law firm, Winston and Strawn. Beatrice was known in Chicago legal circles as the Widowmaker, famous for leaving ex-spouses with nothing but the clothes on their backs and crippling legal debt. "Your Honor," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with practiced condescension as she paced in front of Judge Arthur Harrison's bench. "We are here today to finalize the custody arrangement for the minor child, 6-year-old Lily Sterling. My client, Mr. Sterling, is simply asking the court to recognize reality. The reality that Ms. Woods is, quite frankly, unfit to provide the stable, secure, and nurturing environment that a growing child requires." Pearl bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. Unfit. The word felt like a physical blow. For 6 years, she had been the one waking up at 3 a.m. to soothe Lily's night terrors. She had been the one pureeing organic vegetables, teaching her the alphabet, and kissing scraped knees while Preston was networking at high-end steakhouses or jetting off to Silicon Valley. But Preston had grown tired of his starter wife. When the venture capital money started flowing, Pearl's quiet, unassuming nature no longer fit his brand. He wanted a trophy. He found one in Victoria, a 24-year-old Instagram influencer who was currently sitting in the gallery, loudly chewing gum and flashing a Cartier love bracelet that cost more than Pearl's declared annual income. "Let us review Ms. Woods's financial affidavit, Your Honor," Beatrice continued, holding up a thin stack of papers like a piece of filthy laundry. She lists her occupation as a freelance graphic designer. Last year, her reported income was barely $34,000. She currently resides in a 2-bedroom walk-up apartment in a transitional neighborhood in Logan Square. Meanwhile, Mr. Sterling resides in a secure 5,000-square-foot home in Lincoln Park, complete with a dedicated live-in nanny. Judge Harrison, a man who had presided over messy divorces for 30 years and clearly wanted to be on a golf course by noon, sighed heavily and looked down at Pearl. "Ms. Woods, are you still representing yourself? I advised you at the preliminary hearing to secure counsel." Pearl stood up, her knees trembling slightly, though she kept her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I am representing myself. I simply cannot afford a retainer for an attorney at this time. However, I have compiled extensive documentation showing my daily involvement in Lily's life, her school records, and documentation of poverty does not equate to a stable environment, Ms. Woods," the judge interrupted sharply, waving his hand. The court must look at the best interests of the child. Mr. Sterling can provide top-tier private education at the Latin School of Chicago. He can provide health care, security, and opportunities you simply cannot match on a gig economy income. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, casting a sidelong, pitying glance at Pearl. It was the same look he gave homeless people on Michigan Avenue. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to crush her. He wanted to punish her for not fighting the divorce, for quietly packing her bags and taking Lily when he first brought Victoria to their home. His ego demanded that Pearl be destroyed for not begging him to stay. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Beatrice chimed in, moving in for the kill, "we have subpoenaed Ms. Woods's bank records. Her primary checking account at Chase Bank currently holds a balance of $412.16. She is one late rent payment away from eviction. Giving her even 50% custody is a reckless gamble with Lily's future. We are requesting sole legal and physical custody, with supervised visitation for Ms. Woods." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Supervised visitation. They were treating her like a criminal, a junkie, a threat to her own flesh and blood. In the gallery, Victoria let out a soft, mocking scoff, whispering something into the ear of Preston's brother. Preston covered his mouth to hide a smile. Pearl looked down at her hands. The faded polish on her nails was chipping. She felt the crushing weight of the system, a machine designed to grind people without resources into fine dust. They were so confident. They were so incredibly, blindingly sure that they had her cornered. What Preston didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Pearl's poverty was a carefully constructed choice. It was a test. A test Preston had spectacularly failed. "Ms. Woods," Judge Harrison said, his tone shifting from impatient to vaguely pitying, which was somehow infinitely worse. "Do you have any rebuttal to the financial claims presented by petitioner's counsel? If these bank statements are accurate, I am strongly inclined to grant Mr. Sterling's motion. The disparity in living conditions is simply too vast." Pearl took a deep breath. She remembered the day she met Preston at a coffee shop near Northwestern University. She had been wearing paint-splattered jeans. He had been an ambitious MBA student. She introduced herself as Pearl Woods, an orphan from upstate New York. She never told him that Woods was her mother's maiden name, adopted to escape the suffocating, paparazzi-filled reality of being born into the Astor Harrington dynasty. Her grandfather, Silas Harrington, a man whose real estate and private equity empire was worth an estimated $14 billion, had warned her. "Men will look at you and see a vault, Pearl. Find a man who loves you when you have nothing, and you'll have a partner for life." So, she lived humbly, and Preston had seemed to love her, right up until he didn't need her emotional support anymore. When he struck it rich, he discarded her like a worn-out pair of shoes, completely unaware that his entire $18 million net worth was the equivalent of a rounding error in her grandfather's quarterly tax filings. "Your Honor," Pearl said, finding her voice. It rang clear across the stifling room. "Financial wealth is not the sole metric of a parent's worth. Preston works 80 hours a week. He relies on staff to raise Lily. I am there for her. I know she is terrified of the dark. I know she is allergic to red dye." Number 40. Preston doesn't even know the name of her pediatrician. "Objection," Beatrice snapped. "Relevance. My client employs highly capable staff. Ms. Woods's emotional pleas do not change her dire financial insolvency." "Sustained," the judge mumbled. "Ms. Woods, this court isn't going to punish Mr. Sterling for being successful. We are here to determine if you can adequately provide for the child. Based on Exhibit C, your tax returns, you are barely above the poverty line in the city of Chicago." Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Pearl," he said smoothly, playing the part of the magnanimous victor for the court record. "Just give it up. I'll pay for you to have a nice apartment. I'll even throw you a couple of grand a month so you don't have to scrape by on Fiverr making logos. But Lily belongs with me, where she can have a real life. Stop being selfish." The utter audacity of the man was breathtaking. He was trying to buy her off, trying to purchase her daughter with the loose change in his pocket. Pearl looked at him, truly looking into the eyes of the man she had slept next to for 5 years. There was no love there, only ego. He was a small man who had found a little bit of power and was wielding it like a tyrant. "Are you finished, Preston?" Pearl asked, her voice dropping an octave, losing all the timidness she had displayed over the past 2 hours. Beatrice Montgomery bristled. "Address the court, Ms. Woods, not my client." "I am finished reviewing this," Judge Harrison announced, ignoring the exchange and shuffling the papers on his desk. He reached for his gavel. "Given the overwhelming evidence of Ms. Woods's financial instability and Mr. Sterling's demonstrated ability to provide a superior standard of living, I am prepared to rule on the motion for sole custody." Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs. The masquerade was over. She had wanted to win this on her own merits, to prove that a mother's love was enough in the eyes of the law. But the law, it seemed, only respected capital. "Your Honor," Pearl said loudly, raising her hand, "before you rule, I would like to submit a revised financial disclosure." Beatrice laughed out loud, a harsh, grating sound. "A revised disclosure? What, did you find a $20 bill in your winter coat, Miss Woods?" "The discovery period ended 3 weeks ago. You cannot submit new evidence at the 11th hour." "It is not new evidence, Miss Montgomery," Pearl said, her posture straightening. The slump in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a rigid, aristocratic poise she hadn't utilized in a decade. "It is a complete disclosure. Up until now, I have only disclosed the assets solely in my name under the alias Pearl Woods. I am now prepared to disclose my full legal identity and my beneficiary status." Judge Harrison frowned, his gavel hovering in the air. "Alias. Ms. Woods, what kind of game are you playing in my courtroom? Committing perjury on financial affidavits is a felony." "I haven't committed perjury, Your Honor," Pearl replied coolly. "My legal name is Pearl Astor Harrington, and I am requesting a brief 10-minute recess so my legal counsel can enter the courtroom." Preston let out a derisive snort. "Astor Harrington? Jesus, Pearl, have you lost your mind? Your Honor, she's having a psychotic break. She thinks she's a billionaire now. This just proves she's unfit." "Your Honor, I strongly object to this delay tactic," Beatrice barked, her face flushing with irritation. "This is a desperate, pathetic attempt to halt the proceedings. She doesn't have counsel. She's pro se." Before the judge could respond, the heavy oak double doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak that silenced the room. The bailiff, an older man who had been half asleep by the metal detector, jolted upright. Into the dingy, claustrophobic courtroom strode a phalanx of 3 men and 1 woman. They moved with the synchronized, terrifying precision of apex predators. At the front was Charles Kensington, a legendary senior partner at Kirkland and Ellis. Kensington was a man whose hourly rate could buy a small car, a legal titan who usually only stepped into a courtroom to defend Fortune 500 CEOs from federal antitrust lawsuits. He was flanked by 2 junior partners carrying heavy leather briefcases and an austere-looking woman who served as the lead wealth manager for the Harrington family office. The sheer gravity of their entrance sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Kensington bypassed the gallery entirely, marching past a suddenly pale Victoria and unlatched the swinging wooden gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. "Excuse me," the bailiff stammered, stepping forward. "You can't just barge in here." "Charles Kensington, Your Honor, appearing on behalf of the respondent, Ms. Pearl Astor Harrington," the lead attorney boomed in a baritone voice that commanded absolute obedience. He didn't even look at Preston or Beatrice as he strode to Pearl's table and placed a thick, gold-embossed folder down. Judge Harrison's jaw practically unhinged. He knew who Charles Kensington was. Every judge in Illinois knew who Charles Kensington was. You didn't just hire him, you had to be approved by him. "Mr. Kensington?" the judge said, his voice instantly losing its authoritative edge, replaced by a cautious, bewildered tone. What is the meaning of this? Ms. Woods is proceeding pro se. With all due respect to the court, my client, Ms. Astor Harrington, has elected to retain counsel for the remainder of these proceedings, Kensington said smoothly, shooting a warm, deferential smile toward Pearl. "We formally apologize for our delayed arrival. We had to wait for the Federal Reserve to verify the certified bank drafts, and arranging the necessary security details for my client took a few moments longer than anticipated." Preston, who had been staring at Kensington in confusion, suddenly stood up. "Security details? What is this joke? Pearl, who are these actors? How much did you pay them on Craigslist?" Kensington slowly turned his head, leveling a gaze at Preston that was so cold it could shatter glass. "Mr. Sterling, I highly advise you to let your counsel speak for you. Though, given the caliber of the arguments presented thus far, I use the term counsel incredibly loosely." Beatrice Montgomery jumped to her feet, her face turning a mottled shade of red. "Your Honor, I object to this entire circus. I don't care who this man is. The discovery deadline has passed. Opposing counsel cannot simply waltz in here and dump a new financial affidavit on the bench." Kensington unclasped his briefcase with a sharp click. "Under Illinois Supreme Court Rule 214, we are permitted to supplement discovery if the previous disclosure was incomplete due to a protective legal trust that has only today been unsealed by the primary trustee. Furthermore, Your Honor, this court cannot make a ruling on the best interest of the child based on fraudulent or incomplete data regarding my client's capacity to provide." "Fraudulent?" Preston yelled. "She's a broke graphic designer. She lives in a dump." "Your Honor," Kensington said, ignoring Preston entirely. He handed a stack of watermarked, heavily notarized documents to the bailiff, who hurriedly passed them up to the judge. "I am submitting the unsealed documentation of the Silas Harrington Generational Trust. My client, Pearl Astor Harrington, is the primary beneficiary. As she turned 30 years old yesterday, the trust has officially fully vested into her direct control." Judge Harrison put on his reading glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped to the summary page. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to have stopped humming. The judge stared at the paper. He blinked rapidly, took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and put them back on. He read it again. "Counsel," Judge Harrison croaked, his voice cracking. Is this number accurate?" "It has been verified by independent auditors at PricewaterhouseCoopers and the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, Your Honor," Kensington replied calmly. Beatrice Montgomery marched over to the bench. "I demand to see these documents, Your Honor." The judge numbly handed a copy down to Beatrice. She snatched it up, her eyes scanning the dense legal text until she reached the bolded financial summary at the bottom of page 4. Liquid assets, $1.2 billion. Real estate holdings, private equity, and corporate stock, $4.8 billion. Total vestment value, $6 billion. The paper slipped from Beatrice's fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. She stared at Pearl, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. "What is it?" Preston demanded, walking over and snatching the paper off the floor. "What kind of fake Photoshop garbage is—" Preston's voice died in his throat. His eyes bulged. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. He read the number. Then he looked at the name. Pearl Asta Harrington. "This is impossible," Preston whispered, stepping back, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "Pearl, you clip coupons. You drive a 2010 Honda Civic. You cried when our rent went up $200. Pearl stood up. She didn't look like a battered, exhausted single mother anymore. The cheap Zara blazer remained, but the woman wearing it had transformed. She looked at Preston, her expression completely devoid of pity. "I cried, Preston," Pearl said, her voice echoing in the stunned silence of the room. "Because when the rent went up, you told me I needed to work nights instead of coming home to see our daughter, while you bought yourself a $3,000 espresso machine. I was waiting to see if there was a shred of decency left in you. There isn't." Kensington turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Sterling has argued that he can provide a superior standard of living for the minor child. He has cited his Lincoln Park home and his $18 million net worth. My client, Miss Asta Harrington, currently owns the entire building in which Mr. Sterling's startup operates. She also holds a controlling stake in the venture capital firm that bought his company." A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Victoria dropped her phone on the floor. "We are prepared," Kensington continued mercilessly, "to petition not only for full legal and physical custody, but to open a forensic audit into Mr. Sterling's business practices during the marriage, as we have reason to believe he hid assets prior to the divorce filing. We will bury him in litigation until his $18 million is entirely consumed by legal fees." Preston collapsed into his chair as if his legs had been kicked out from under him. He looked at Beatrice pleadingly. "Beatrice, do something. Object." But the Widowmaker was silent. She knew when she was outgunned. She was a sniper facing down a nuclear warhead. The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, thick and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that follows a catastrophic car crash, right before the screaming begins. Judge Arthur Harrison sat frozen, his gavel suspended in midair, his eyes darting frantically between the unassuming woman in the clearance rack blazer and the $6 billion in verified assets printed on the heavy stock parchment before him. Beatrice Montgomery, the feared Widowmaker of Winston and Strawn, looked as though she had swallowed a mouthful of ground glass. She slowly backed away from the plaintiff's table, instinctively distancing herself from Preston Sterling. Beatrice billed $1,200 an hour. She did not go down with sinking ships. She certainly did not pick fights with the Asta Harrington family, a dynasty that kept firms like hers on retainer just to handle their municipal zoning disputes. "Your Honor," Beatrice stammered, her typically commanding voice reduced to a thin, raspy whisper. My client was entirely unaware of these circumstances. The financial disclosures provided to my office were based on what Mr. Sterling believed to be true, because he never bothered to look past his own towering ego. Charles Kensington interrupted, his baritone voice slicing through Beatrice's excuses like a scalpel. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on the judge. My client, Pearl Asta Harrington, adhered strictly to the Harrington Family Trust protocols. Beneficiaries are required to live independently without access to the principal capital until their 30th birthday. It is a safeguard designed to foster character, work ethic, and most importantly, to weed out opportunistic partners. Kensington turned slightly, allowing his gaze to fall on Preston. A test that Mr. Sterling failed with spectacular, almost clinical precision. Preston's face had cycled through pale shock, flushed embarrassment, and was now settling into a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. "This is entrapment," Preston suddenly shouted, his voice cracking hysterically. He pointed a trembling finger at Pearl. "You lied to me. For 6 years. You let me pay the rent. You let me buy the groceries. You sat there and watched me work my fingers to the bone, building my company while you were sitting on billions. You're a sociopath, Pearl." Pearl did not flinch. She stood tall, the aristocratic posture she had suppressed for years fully returning. "You didn't work your fingers to the bone, Preston. You used the $50,000 my poor, deceased mother left me to seed your first software prototype. Money I gave you willingly, because I believed in you." She took a slow step toward the center aisle. "And when Sequoia Capital finally bought your company for $18 million, what was your first instinct? Did you secure our daughter's future? Did you thank the wife who supported you when you were nothing? No. You moved a 24-year-old into a condo, served me with divorce papers on my birthday, and tried to legally rip my child from my arms by weaponizing my manufactured poverty against me. Your Honor, please, Preston pleaded, turning wildly to the bench. She committed fraud. You can't let her get away with this. She lied to the court on her initial affidavit. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. "Sit down and shut your mouth, Mr. Sterling, before I hold you in contempt." The judge took a deep, steadying breath, clearly trying to recalibrate his entire understanding of the universe. He looked down at the documents provided by Kensington. "Mr. Kensington, while I am astounded by this revelation, the fact remains that Miss Astor Harrington, did submit an incomplete financial affidavit to this court." "Actually, Your Honor, she did not," Kensington replied smoothly, unlatching a second thinner leather portfolio. "If you turn to page 9 of her original filing, buried in the appendices, you will see she listed a contingent future interest in an undisclosed blind trust. It was legally accurate and compliant with Illinois disclosure laws for unvested assets. Mr. Sterling's counsel simply failed to depose her on it, assuming it was a nominal life insurance policy or a modest inheritance." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut. It was a rookie mistake. She had been so focused on crushing a nobody that she hadn't bothered to investigate the fine print. Malpractice lawsuits had been born from less. "However," Kensington continued, his tone shifting from deferential to outright predatory, "speaking of fraud, we have a much more pressing matter for the court's attention." He pulled out a thick stack of bank records, emblazoned with the logo of Credit Suisse. "During the mandated financial discovery period," Kensington announced, "Mr. Sterling claimed a net worth of exactly $18.2 million. Yet, my client's wealth management team at Goldman Sachs, utilizing routine forensic accounting measures to prepare for this custody battle, uncovered a series of offshore wire transfers. 3 weeks before filing for divorce, Mr. Sterling moved $4.5 million into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Logistics Solutions, a company solely directed by his brother, who is sitting right there in the gallery." Every head in the courtroom whipped around to look at Preston's brother, David, who suddenly looked like he was going to vomit. "You hid assets, Mr. Sterling," Judge Harrison growled, his face darkening with genuine judicial fury. "You stood in my courtroom, swore an oath, and deliberately concealed $4.5 million to avoid splitting it in the divorce settlement." "No, that was an investment," Preston stammered, sweat beading on his forehead and dripping onto his custom silk tie. It was capital allocation for a new venture. Beatrice, tell him! Beatrice Montgomery stepped entirely away from the table. Your Honor, Winston and Strawn formally requests to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Sterling, effective immediately. We cannot represent a client who has committed perjury and utilized our firm to submit fraudulent financial documents to this court. You can't do that! Preston shrieked, grabbing Beatrice's arm. I paid you $100,000 on retainer. You work for me. Beatrice violently yanked her arm away, her eyes flashing with venom. Do not touch me, Preston. You lied to me. You made a fool of my firm in front of Charles Kensington and a sitting judge. You are on your own. She briskly gathered her legal pads, shoved them into her designer briefcase, and marched down the aisle, the click-clack of her heels echoing like a ticking clock, marking the end of Preston's life as he knew it. In the gallery, Victoria, the Instagram influencer, who had been mocking Pearl just 20 minutes prior, was having a harsh collision with reality. She looked from the red-faced, sweating Preston to the icy, composed Pearl, and finally to the imposing figure of Charles Kensington. She didn't need a law degree to understand the math. Preston wasn't the apex predator. He was the prey, and he was about to be financially gutted. Victoria quietly picked up her Hermes Birkin bag, the one Preston had bought her last month, and slipped out the heavy oak doors without looking back. Preston didn't even notice she was gone. Judge Harrison took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Mr. Sterling, the willful concealment of marital assets is a severe violation of court orders. Not only does it entirely invalidate your standing in this custody hearing, but I am legally obligated to forward this transcript to the state's attorney's office for a potential perjury investigation. Preston slumped into his chair, the starch completely gone from his posture. The arrogant tech bro who had walked into the room ready to ruin his ex-wife was dead. In his place was a terrified, broken man staring into the abyss. Your Honor, Pearl said gently. It was the first time she had spoken in minutes, and the quiet dignity in her voice forced the room to hang on her every word. I do not wish to see the father of my child sent to federal prison, despite what he has done to me. Lily loves him. Preston looked up, a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. Was she going to save him? After everything, was the timid, forgiving Pearl still in there? However, Pearl continued, her eyes locking onto Preston's, cold and unyielding. I will not allow my daughter to be raised by a man whose moral compass is dictated by his bank account. A man who views human beings as disposable stepping stones. She turned back to the judge. I am submitting a revised motion, Your Honor. I am requesting sole legal and physical custody of our daughter, Lily. Mr. Sterling will be granted supervised visitation 2 weekends a month at a facility of my choosing. Pearl, please, Preston begged, his voice breaking. She's my daughter too. You can't take her away from me. You were going to take her from me an hour ago, Preston, Pearl replied, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried through the silent room. You were going to leave me with nothing, smiling while you did it. You wanted to play a game of ruin. You just didn't realize you were playing against the house. Charles Kensington stepped forward, sliding a new document across the table toward Preston. Furthermore, Your Honor, as punitive damages for the blatant fraud committed regarding the Cayman Islands Shell Company, we are asserting a claim on 70% of Mr. Sterling's remaining legal assets, as is standard precedent in Illinois for malicious concealment during dissolution of marriage. 70%? Preston gasped. That leaves me with almost nothing after taxes and the penalties. I'll be ruined. You will be exactly where you intended to leave Miss Asta Harrington, Kensington stated flatly. Penniless, living in a transitional neighborhood, and forced to rebuild your life. Only you won't have the excuse of an impending trust fund. You will just have the consequences of your own greed." Judge Harrison didn't hesitate. He looked at Preston with utter disgust. "Mr. Sterling, you attempted to use this court as a weapon to bludgeon a woman you believed to be defenseless. You committed perjury, and you attempted to defraud your spouse. You are incredibly lucky. Ms. Asta Harrington is not pressing for immediate criminal charges." The judge picked up his pen and began aggressively signing the orders Kensington had provided. The court grants respondent's motion for sole legal and physical custody of the minor child, Lily Sterling. Petitioner is granted supervised visitation, pending a psychological evaluation. Furthermore, the court freezes all of Mr. Sterling's domestic accounts pending the forensic audit requested by the respondent's counsel. The gavel came down. This time it wasn't a death knell for Pearl. It was a resurrection. "We are adjourned," Judge Harrison announced. As the bailiff moved to officially close the proceedings, Charles Kensington began quietly packing his briefcase. The two junior partners stood at attention behind Pearl. Preston sat immobilized at his table. He looked over at Pearl. She was no longer the mousy girl he had met at a coffee shop, nor the exhausted mother he had discarded. She was Pearl Asta Harrington, an heiress to an empire, surrounded by a legion of lawyers, untouchable and utterly victorious. "Pearl," Preston whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. If I had known—" Pearl paused as she picked up her cheap imitation leather portfolio. She looked down at him, her expression a mix of pity and finality. "That is exactly the problem, Preston," she said softly. "You would only have loved me if you had known. And that isn't love at all." She turned her back on him and walked down the center aisle. The heavy oak doors swung open for her, not to a life of poverty and struggle, but to a world of absolute freedom, her daughter waiting for her on the other side. The fallout from courtroom 302 was not merely a defeat for Preston Sterling. It was a systematic, financially catastrophic dismantling of his entire existence. Within 48 hours of Judge Harrison's ruling, the forensic accounting team from Goldman Sachs, operating under the relentless direction of Charles Kensington, descended upon Preston's finances like a swarm of locusts. The injunction froze everything. Preston's platinum American Express cards were declined at a high-end steakhouse in River North, forcing him to leave his Rolex Daytona as collateral just to cover the bill. When he returned to his 5,000-square-foot Lincoln Park mansion, he found the locks changed and a notice of foreclosure taped to the door. In his arrogance, he had leveraged the house to hide more capital in his Cayman Islands shell company. Victoria, true to the instincts of a predator who realizes the watering hole has dried up, vanished entirely. She blocked his number, deleted all their photos from her Instagram feed, and within a week was comfortably installed on a yacht in Monaco, courtesy of a hedge fund manager she had met at a gallery opening. Preston was left entirely alone in a mid-priced hotel near O'Hare Airport, staring at a ceiling stained with water damage, waiting for the legal blows to stop falling. They did not stop. Kensington's audit uncovered more than just the hidden $4.5 million. It revealed a labyrinth of tax evasion, inflated corporate expenses, and fraudulent venture capital pitch decks. The Securities and Exchange Commission, tipped off by the aggressive audit, opened their own investigation. Preston's remaining $18 million, already slashed by the 70% punitive damages awarded to Pearl, was rapidly vaporized by IRS penalties, massive legal fees, and the sudden calling in of leveraged debts. 3 months after he had sat in that courtroom, adjusting his silk tie and smiling at Pearl's impending ruin, Preston Sterling was officially bankrupt. He was forced to take a job as a mid-level back-end developer, at a logistics firm in the suburbs, commuting an hour each way in a leased 2012 Toyota Corolla. He rented a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the exact same transitional Logan Square neighborhood he had once mocked Pearl for living in. Every time he paid his rent, he was painfully aware that the building management company was a subsidiary of Harrington Real Estate Holdings. He was, quite literally, paying rent to his ex-wife. Meanwhile, Pearl Astor Harrington stepped out of the shadows and back into the empire that was her birthright. But she did it on her own terms. She did not move into a penthouse in the city or buy a fleet of exotic cars. Instead, she purchased a sprawling, secluded historic estate in the Hudson Valley of New York, surrounded by hundreds of acres of ancient oak trees and rolling green hills. It was a place where 6-year-old Lily could run freely, safely insulated from the paparazzi and the sycophants who trailed the Harrington dynasty. Pearl retained her grounded nature. She still cooked Lily's meals, she still read her bedtime stories, and she still knew the name of her pediatrician. But now she possessed the armor to ensure no one would ever threaten their peace again. The late autumn sun sank low over the Hudson Valley, casting long, fiery shadows across the manicured lawns of the Astor Harrington estate in Rhinebeck, New York. The property, originally designed in 1898 by the legendary architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White, spanned 400 acres of ancient oak trees, private lakes, and rolling green hills. Inside the sprawling limestone manor, the faint, melodic notes of a Chopin nocturne echoed through the halls. Pearl was sitting at a custom 1920s Steinway grand piano, guiding 6-year-old Lily's small fingers across the ivory keys. To the outside world, Pearl had seemingly vanished from the gritty reality of Logan Square into an impenetrable fortress of generational wealth. She no longer clipped coupons or anxiously checked the balance of her Chase checking account. Instead, her mornings involved conference calls with the Wealth Management Division at J.P. Morgan Private Bank and reviewing real estate acquisitions across 3 continents. Yet, despite the dizzying transition, Pearl remained fiercely anchored. She still woke up at 6 every morning to make Lily's lunch, refusing to farm out the core duties of motherhood to the estate's extensive staff. She knew that wealth could build a house, but only presence could build a home. A heavy, measured knock at the music room's double doors interrupted their lesson. Thomas, the estate's imposing head of security, a former director within the rigid hierarchy of the Pinkerton agency, stepped into the room. He carried a single crumpled envelope on a silver tray. "I apologize for the interruption, Ms. Astor Harrington," Thomas said, his voice a low gravel. The mail screening facility in Manhattan intercepted this. It bypasses the usual legal filters because it was handwritten and addressed to your old alias. I thought you should see it before we incinerate it per protocol. Pearl kissed the top of Lily's head, whispered for her to practice her scales, and walked over to Thomas. She picked up the envelope. The return address was a P.O. box in a notoriously run-down sector of Joliet, Illinois. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, and immediately recognizable. It was from Preston. Pearl walked out to the sweeping stone terrace, the chill of the November air biting through her cashmere sweater, and broke the seal. The letter was 5 pages of pure, unadulterated desperation. Pearl, Preston's letter began, the ink smudged as if by sweat or tears. "I am begging you. The SEC isn't just fining me. The Department of Justice is stepping in. Because of the Cayman Island accounts that Kensington exposed, they are pushing for a federal indictment for wire fraud and tax evasion. Skadden Arps dropped me. No reputable defense attorney will take my case without a $500,000 retainer. I'm working data entry on the night shift for $12 an hour. I live in a studio above a bowling alley. I have nothing left. Please, Pearl, for the sake of Lily, don't let her father go to federal prison. Alone. Just alone. You have billions. It's pocket change to you. Pearl stared at the frantic scrawl, feeling an eerie absence of emotion. 6 months ago, a plea like this would have kept her awake for weeks. She would have bled herself dry trying to fix him. Now, she simply saw the cold, mechanical reality of a predator caught in a trap of his own making. He wasn't sorry for what he had done to her. He was only sorry he was facing the consequences. He had tried to strip her of her child simply because she was poor. He had laughed at her vulnerability. Bad news? A dry, authoritative voice asked from the doorway. Silas Harrington, the 82-year-old patriarch of the dynasty, stepped onto the terrace. He walked with a silver-headed cane, his posture as straight and unyielding as a steel girder. Even in his twilight years, Silas commanded the kind of gravity that made Fortune 500 CEOs sweat. Pearl handed the letter to her grandfather. Silas adjusted his spectacles, reading the frantic pleas with a look of mild distaste, like a man inspecting a spoiled piece of fruit. "He wants a loan to pay for a criminal defense attorney," Pearl said, her voice entirely flat. "He thinks because I am Lily's mother, I will save him from the Department of Justice." Silas chuckled, a dark, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "The arrogance of mediocre men never ceases to amaze me. He believes your empathy is a weakness he can still exploit, even from the gutter." Silas folded the letter perfectly in half and handed it back to her. "What will you do?" "Nothing," Pearl replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "When I sat in courtroom 302, I realized that if the roles were reversed, Preston wouldn't have thrown me a life preserver. He would have held my head under the water. I am not going to drown him, but I am certainly not obligated to teach him how to swim." Silas smiled grimly, tapping his cane against the flagstones. "Good, because I have a confession to make, Pearl. I wasn't entirely passive during your little social experiment in Chicago. When Charles Kensington initiated the asset freeze, I had the family office purchase the leveraged debt on Mr. Sterling's Cayman Island Shell Company through a proxy firm in London." Pearl turned to him, her eyes widening in surprise. "You bought his debt? Why?" "To ensure it could never be discharged in a standard bankruptcy," Silas said smoothly, his eyes flashing with a ruthless, predatory intellect. "Even if the federal government lets him out of prison in 10 years, he will owe the Harrington estate millions in default penalties. I wanted to guarantee that the man who tried to steal my great-granddaughter would spend the rest of his natural life waking up every morning, owing us his very existence. No one strikes at this family and walks away." A shiver ran down Pearl's spine. It was a stark reminder of the terrifying power she now wielded. It was the Harrington way, absolute, calculated, and terrifyingly thorough. But while Pearl appreciated her grandfather's brand of scorched earth justice, she knew she had a different calling for her wealth. "I appreciate the insurance policy, Grandpa," Pearl said softly, tearing Preston's letter precisely into quarters and dropping it into the terrace's heavy bronze fire pit. "But I have my own plans for the capital, and I need Charles Kensington in New York by tomorrow morning." The next day, the atmosphere in the private conference room at the apex of the Chrysler Building was electric with anticipation. Pearl sat at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table, flanked by Charles Kensington and a dozen of the most ruthless, brilliant legal minds from firms across Manhattan and Washington, D.C. She wore a sharply tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She was no longer playing defense. "Gentlemen and ladies," Pearl began, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who controlled a $6 billion endowment. "6 months ago, I sat in a stifling courtroom in Cook County. I was facing a man who had intentionally hidden millions of dollars, hired a vicious attack dog of an attorney, and planned to use my manufactured poverty to take my daughter away from me. The judge was ready to let it happen. The system was ready to process me like meat through a grinder, simply because I lacked capital." The room was dead silent. Charles Kensington watched her with a look of profound respect. "I was saved by a deus ex machina," Pearl continued, her eyes sweeping across the high-powered lawyers. "I had the Harrington Trust waiting in the wings. But for tens of thousands of women across this country, there is no trust fund. There is no Charles Kensington bursting through the doors at the 11th hour. There are only women who lose their children, their homes, and their dignity to wealthy, abusive, and narcissistic men who weaponize the family court system to destroy them." Pearl pressed a button on the console in front of her. The massive screens on the wall flickered to life, displaying a highly detailed corporate structure. "Today, we are officially launching the Woods Legal Defense Foundation," Pearl announced. "I am personally endowing the foundation with $500 million in liquid capital to be managed by Goldman Sachs Philanthropy. Our mandate is simple, and it is singular. We are going to find mothers who are being financially and legally suffocated by predatory ex-partners. We will provide them with the highest tier of legal representation on the planet, entirely free of charge." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. $500 million dedicated solely to family court litigation was unprecedented. It was a DePearl of war. If a billionaire tech executive tries to bury his wife in frivolous custody motions, Pearl said, her voice hardening into steel, we will bury him in forensic audits. If an abusive husband tries to hide assets in offshore accounts to starve out the mother of his children, we will hire the best private intelligence firms in the world to find every single dime. We are not just going to defend these women. We are going to go on the offensive. We are going to make it financially suicidal for any man to use the legal system as an instrument of terror against a mother. She looked directly at Kensington. Charles, you are stepping down from your corporate antitrust practice at Kirkland and Ellis. I am buying out your partnership. You will serve as the chief legal director of the Woods Foundation. Your job is to build an army of litigators who terrify opposing counsel the moment they enter their appearances. Kensington smiled, a genuine, dangerous grin. It would be the honor of my career, Miss Asta Harrington. The era of the wealthy bully in family court ends today, Pearl concluded, standing up from the table. We are going to level the playing field, and we are going to salt the earth behind us. Let's get to work. Months later, back at the Rhinebeck estate, Pearl sat by the edge of the private lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of violet and gold. Lily was sitting next to her, tossing small pebbles into the water, giggling every time one made a satisfying splash. Pearl's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a secure message from Kensington. First case closed in Seattle. Tech CEO attempted to bankrupt his wife and take primary custody. We deployed the forensic team, found a secondary ledger, and forced a settlement. She keeps the house, full custody, and he is paying triple alimony to avoid a fraud indictment. Opposing counsel practically cried. Pearl locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her pocket, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She had survived the crucible. She had walked through the fire of Preston's betrayal and the cold indifference of the legal system, and she had emerged not merely intact, but forged into something unbreakable. She had proven that true power wasn't about destroying the weak. It was about building a fortress for those who couldn't protect themselves. Preston Sterling was a ghost, a cautionary tale wasting away in obscurity, crushed under the weight of his own greed and the quiet, merciless vengeance of Silas Harrington. But Pearl Astor Harrington was just getting started. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into a shield for thousands of others, ensuring that when the gavel fell, it would finally fall in the name of true justice. Pearl's journey from a dismissed, impoverished gig worker to the commanding matriarch of her own destiny is a stark reminder that true power does not always announce itself with a Rolex or a designer suit. The court system, blinded by Preston's arrogant display of superficial wealth, almost facilitated the ultimate tragedy, stripping a loving mother of her child. However, the revelation of the Harrington empire shattered that illusion, exposing the fragility of a life built entirely on ego and financial bullying. Preston's catastrophic downfall serves as a poetic, satisfying justice, proving that those who weaponize the law against the vulnerable often engineer their own destruction. In the end, Pearl's decision to weaponize her immense wealth, not for revenge, but to protect other disenfranchised women, elevates her victory. It transforms a dramatic courtroom twist into a lasting legacy of empathy, resilience, and unyielding maternal strength.